Good morning and welcome to WEP on Air. My name is Michelle Ponto and I'm from the KAUST communications team. Today my guest is Elisabeth Churchill, who is one of the directors of user experience at Google. Elisabeth is an applied social scientist working in the area of human-computer interaction, mobile computing, and social media. In 2010, she was recognized as a distinguished scientist by the Association of Computing Machinery. Welcome to WEP on Air today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So as I mentioned, you are a user experience director at Google. Mm-hmm. What exactly does user experience mean to those of us, those of them watching in the audience who aren't familiar with the term?
Well, user experience covers a wide range of different things, but I think the one that'll be most familiar to all of us is we all should look in our bags and our pockets, and we have probably a mobile phone or something similar, and we look at how people interact with devices through surfaces. And so for most of the work that I'm doing, I work on surfaces that are screens. So tablets, phones, but you can also imagine touchscreen interactions on large displays. So a lot of my work is user experience on touchscreen interaction for computational devices. But you can also start to think about the user experience as being not just the user as a consumer, like you or I, with these discretionary devices for recreation. But a lot of the work that my team does is also look at designers and developers and the tools that they use. So they are users of tools too, which are computational tools. So we look at how do designers and developers use all of the different kinds of applications they need to create the experiences for everyday consumers. An interface in a car, if you like, it's a user experience of an interface. Cockpits in airplanes. So anywhere that you see information in space that's sort of digitally rendered and could be changing in real time, giving me information so that I can make decisions. User experience research and design looks at all of those different kinds of experiences.
That's interesting. I didn't really think about how your car is basically a computer and how you interact with it, how you turn on the radio, how it connects to your phone is all part of the experience of being inside there. What other things are happening in day-to-day life that people might not even realize is part of AI and it's already a part of their world?
Well, I think bringing up AI is really good because historically, a lot of the interfaces that we would use would be dials and knobs. So the discipline of user experience research and design has its history in ergonomics, in physical design. And it was during the Second World War, really, that it really started to become a discipline of information ergonomics, information design. And you're right to bring up AI, because in the history of our discipline, things were fairly stable and static. You know, you designed something and people learned how to use it, and it was the same the next time they came to it, and you could become an expert. But now with AI, the interactions at the surface can change really radically. In the visual surface, imagine if you're ever online shopping. You know, when you start to see different recommendations to you for shopping, you know, you've bought this before, maybe you like these kinds of things. That's a sort of AI technique which is filtering information so that you get the information that is relevant to you. But you can also now start to think about not just visual interactions, but if any of you have, you know, a device in your home where you speak to it, it can be also conversational interactions. And AI is changing how that conversation goes from the point of view of your partner is learning, your partner is the system, and you're learning, and so you're developing together. And so as we move forward with user experience research and design, we have to start to think about the whole system of the person or the people, because it could be both of us, and the device, and all of the computation that lies behind it, and all of the data sources that are being used. And we're using AI in order to sample the information effectively to change the nature of the interaction. So we're really a sort of learning system together.
So AI, or artificial intelligence, it is going beyond just making life easier or adding more technology to our lives. It almost is creating, it's seeing our personalities and merging into that. I remember one apartment building I lived at in the US. When I would put my pass into it, the elevator would change to music I liked, and the imagery would change to something that I had picked out because it knew it was me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the environment changes to your preferences. There was some really interesting work done in gyms years and years and years ago. Now, a gym is, a very public space. And there's lots of people who all have their own music taste. So what the guys did was to try and figure out how to use techniques so that everybody got a little bit of a share of their preferences around music. So people would badge in. And then there was this really interesting set of algorithms which were around how do I not just make sure that your music is up for some time, and so is mine, but how do you get the different genres of music so that they flow into each other so that it's not a jarring experience. And I think that's where the really interesting challenges start to come, where you have this sort of resolution of the different conflicts of different interpersonal and personal needs. That's when it gets really interestingly, from a computational point of view, very interesting. And from an interaction design point of view, quite complicated.
That kind of leads to my next question, as you always think of artificial intelligence and that it's personalized to the user. But like you said, user experience is sometimes public. You can't design every single car to be perfectly individual. And we do see ourselves as individual, but from your research, are we really, or is everyone completely unique, or are there certain things that a lot of people do together where you can kind of say, okay, most people like this type of experience?
Yeah, I think that, everybody wants to think they're the precious snowflake. And, we do have dimensions of ourselves that may be unique, and especially our personal histories are quite unique. But, humans have a lot in common. And one of the things I will talk about later today is how you start to understand, from the very individual characteristics. So, for example, eyesight. Your eyesight and my eyesight might be not the same. But there's a whole set of derived guidelines for an ophthalmologist to figure out how to correct your eyes and my eyes to be a particular standard, right? And so each of us have a slightly different, correction, but we're all going towards a standard. But also the ophthalmologist has a standard set of tests they do and a standard set of tools they have in order to bring us sort of together to this agreed upon norm for vision, right? And one of the great things in user experience research is when you're down in the details on the individual level, you always want to be thinking about how many people do I need to look at to see what diversity there is? What are the edge cases that I need to consider? What are the edges of my problem space, if you like, that I need to design for and think about? And then how do I put that into guidelines so that people out in the world, the ophthalmologist or a designer or a developer or an engineer, can actually look at those guidelines and build for the general, but allow tailoring for the individual. And I think we have that as a really great challenge. They say design is a wicked problem. That is one of the wicked problems of design, which is, getting something so that most people can use it, but that so it can be tailored to the individual.
Okay, and change is always happening in technology and AI. Like even, I went to Instagram this morning and there was something a little bit different that they had changed in their interface. And the little changes you're able to keep up with. What about those people that, is there a certain demographic that are falling behind? They're not able to keep up, and they didn't embrace it years ago, and now things are so advanced that it's going to be difficult? Yeah.
Yes, but I think there's another way to think about it, which is even as designers and developers, we get stuck in our own assumptions about what should be, right? So I'll give you an example. This was from research that I did years ago. I came from this model of, desktop computers and computer science and computation. And I always saw the personal phone as like a little computer. But then I went and started interviewing elderly people who'd never seen a computer or never used a computer. They'd never had a desktop computer. And when I asked them about computation, they were like, oh, well, I don't do computers, but I do the internet. And this elderly lady just pointed to her phone, which she was using to FaceTime, which she was using to be in touch with her friends and her grandchildren and all the rest of it. And she had no idea of computation. So her mental model of computation was this high utility interaction that she gets from this device. The way I look at this device is it's quite complicated because of the baggage that I bring to it. So I think in that instance, I was the one who was being left behind Because I was thinking of this as this really complicated device, and she was just, using it for her everyday life. So I think we have to also challenge about what left behind means. But I think your point, there's another point to your story, or your question, which we should all bear in mind, which is that lots and lots of people are being left behind because they don't have access. And there are at least two major groups of people who don't have access that we really need to think about carefully. One is people who have accessibility issues, people who are, for example, vision impaired, people who are, hearing impaired, for example. And we just don't do enough for embedding accessibility, that diversity and the edge cases into our main design frameworks, which are designed for the quotes masses. So that's one group that I think are being left behind, and that's through negligence in our own practice, I would say, that we can change. The other group that's being left behind are people who don't have access because, for example, they are at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of resources, whether it's financial resources or whether it's access to things like the internet. And that is, our responsibility, I think, as, educators and as people involved in sort of broader provisioning, shall we say, and decisions around how funding gets allocated, to make sure that people do get access. And I think when phones and devices were discretionary only, okay, but now the internet and the AI systems we're talking about are the very fabric of being part of this world today. So I think it's our collective responsibility to make sure that folks are not being left behind who are in that category.
That's interesting that you mentioned people who have accessibility issues, such as the people who are blind or have trouble hearing. Because in the 80s and 90s, the smart homes were always promoted to help those people, but now it's the general public, and like you said, we've kind of left them out of the loop and are worried about other things to make the general public more happy about AI.
But I think that the smart homes are offering a great opportunity, and that opportunity, we can take advantage of that by saying that within any home, there are people with diverse needs. On my team, we are just about to start doing some ethnographic work, which is to go into people's homes to study their use of technology, to look at home devices. And the discipline of ethnography comes from anthropology, so you can probably imagine that it's really studying people in their real world contexts. And one of the things we've done is to make sure that several of the families that we're going to partner with to understand their use of technology in the home have people who have some form of accessibility needs. And that will give us data around how the devices that we create and the prototypes for devices we create are being taken into the social space, but also being used by a diverse range of people.
That will be an interesting study, because some people, when things don't work, you come up with your own ways to use it. So it'll be interesting to see how people are using things beyond what you thought they would possibly be used for.
Yeah, that kind of appropriation is really exciting, because that can lead us to think about how to design differently for everybody.
The next question I have has to go with, is AI changing our behaviors in different ways?
Oh yes, I have way too many handbags. I gave the shopping example earlier. I think access to information is changing our behavior because of access to information. And I joke about shopping, but think about, have you used a mapping app recently? Yeah. It's completely changing because we've got all these applications, all this information now, how we navigate space. If you chat to people who are, I live in San Francisco, and one of the grand complaints in San Francisco in some of the posher areas is that routes through the city that nobody ever used to take, and they were quiet and leafy, are now just like thoroughfares for people driving through, because the maps are now rendering those as visible because they're less trafficked and therefore quicker. Mm-hmm. And so we're changing how people move through time and space. Other ways in which AI, I think, is affecting us that's a little more invisible is that in the world of medicine, a lot of new learning techniques are being applied to look at, for example, X-rays and so forth, to start to look at all of these different sources of information and come up with patterns to enable consultants, doctors and nurses to be able to see patterns and build different models of illness and disease and do a more effective diagnosis. So that's another area that I think is enormous, where, you know, it's sort of quietly under the hood disrupting something that's good for everybody. Mm-hmm. You know, it's really changing medicine.
I think health might be another area that people, because of all the smart devices that that measure your heartbeat, how much you sleep, I think it's making people a little bit more aware of what's going on. So it'll be interesting to see in 5 or 10 years from now if health issues change, if obesity goes down or diabetes goes down, or...
You know, we have to be super careful again, though. It's interesting because there's this lovely study done where, you know, caretakers. So again, with the elderly, a lot of the elderly, you know, folks who have health issues, their caretakers are the ones who want to be able to monitor what's going on for them, right? It's like, you know, Dad, did you keep your diet right today? You know, Mum, did you go for a walk? And there are these super sort of naive scenarios around how, you know, there's a walking stick that the elderly parent, the children will see whether, you know, Mum went for her walk today or not. And actually, you know, the elderly folks are resisting this and are just going, I will not be surveilled. Right? So I think on the very interpersonal consumer level, whether we'll all be healthier or not will depend on, you know, resistances and for whom are we being healthy and why, and what are the sort of motivational factors. But I think where AI is going to really change our well-being is in this accumulation of data for things like diagnosis, in order to help the experts help us more effectively. And I think the sort of, I don't know about you, but I've tried lots of apps around exercise, and I'm on it for about a month, and then I'm like, don't care anymore.
The app is the new gym.
Yes, exactly. That's so true, exactly.
Do you think, because AI is everywhere, whether we know what's happening or not, are there issues that people are worried that we are beginning to know too much, or scientists are beginning to know too much, there's not enough privacy anymore?
I think people aren't worried so much about scientists, maybe. I might be wrong on that, but there is incredible concern because, you know, AI, artificial intelligence, is this giant term. And it's this term of art, if you like, to say, you know, we are smart. But it's also just really a set of techniques. And so underneath this big umbrella term and the sort of media hype around that, there's a bunch of really pragmatic techniques, some of which are understood and some of which are not. So when I was talking about shopping, you know, sort of collaborative filtering, which is the sort of underlying technique for a lot of recommendation systems on your favorite shopping, you know, site, you know, it's fairly well understood in terms of what data goes in and how the data's managed, and we're still not that great at personalization, but the models are sort of understood, the failures are understood, and it's often not sort of safety critical. Then you go all the way up to things like, you know, deep learning and sort of deep mind and these algorithms, which are AI algorithms, where we're not quite sure what the boundaries are of the data, what's going in, what's going out. We're not quite sure of the quality of the data. And so if you study people who use a lot of these techniques, there's a lot of human judgment involved in how those algorithms are managed. And increasingly we're understanding that biases are introduced into the data and into therefore what's learned, into therefore how learning occurs and what comes out the other end. And so, for example, if you have a data set of people's faces and you only sample from a very small demographic, for example, of skin color, of those faces, and you sort of think this giant AI technique is representative of the entire population, it isn't. It is representative of what went in and of the biases that may exist in the algorithms, and then what comes out is inherently biased. So there's some beautiful work that's being done in that area of algorithmic bias in AI, and we're only at the beginning of understanding what we need to do to be more effective there. The other grand concern, which is very important, is of course information is always power. So who has the information about you or about me? Is it transparent? Am I able to even inquire about what that information is? Is there any way in which I can interrogate its veracity? Who does know, who doesn't? Who's paying for the information potentially? So, you know, we're at the very beginning of understanding data as currency. And just as all of the issues occur around currency as money, with all of the fraud and all of the, you know, sort of just bad actors, if you like, it's the same kind of world that we are now having to interrogate around data.
That's an interesting point. I never really thought about how the transfer of data is so far kind of only one way. The corporations or whoever is buying it has access to it, but I don't have access to it. I don't even know what data they took from me or how they're reading my profile, or I can't read your profile, but they could.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's very interesting.
There's a lot of really interesting movement in the open government initiatives. The Open Data Initiative in the UK, ODI, and open data government activities in the States. You know, sort of government as representative of the people. Even in that instance where the idea is that we should be able to share the data we have on people, right, with them, starting to open that up is so hard. Understanding how we should not be putting people at risk as a government. I'm speaking as a government, I'm not a government, but you know what I'm saying. Understanding how to improve literacy. You know, so even if I could give you your data, how would you understand it? Back to the user experience, what tools do I need to build for you so that you can even understand what that data means for you? You know, that's the user experience. Human data interaction is a whole new area of academic research that's really starting to bubble up, and everything from how do you do data visualization to how do you start to pull data that's your own data, or data, for example, for your neighborhood or for your city.
Okay. I have one more question, and that's, where is the future going? Where is this going in the future for you? This happens really quickly. So the next 5 years, which areas do you think are going to be changing, which are going to stay the same, and are any going to go backwards?
It's a really good question. What's going to change? Well, I hope that what we're just talking about right now, usable security and data security, I think we're going to invest a lot more in that, and that's really, really important, give people more access. The other thing is that I think, you know, we'll still rely on our devices. I think there'll still be devices, but those devices might be, you know, more in our environments as well. So the smart homes and so forth, and cars, you know, a lot more computation everywhere. What's going to change? I think, if that's going to change, I should say what's going to stay the same. We're still going to, as humans, need to do a lot of conflict resolution ourselves. A lot of understanding, learning, helping each other. There's a lot of social protocol stuff that we're still going to have to work on, using social media. Right? We can put as many people in touch with each other, or as few people in touch with each other. We can start to put boundaries between people, but there's still going to be, humans still need to get right in the loop to actually do negotiation and discussion. I do not want to leave all negotiation to algorithms.
Yeah.
And in terms of going backwards, I don't know if you can go into the past. I think the past always sort of comes forward with us. I don't know what we would go back to. This is maybe a stupid example, but it's a very concrete one. You know, I always believe in politeness. And when the devices, the talking devices in my home, when I say thank you and they say thank you back, and when they start to know about each other, and when they start to be polite to me, maybe we can go back to a time of politeness and actually put more politeness into our technology. That's what I'd like. Fewer notifications, fewer interruptions, more politeness.
Actually, that's a good point. And that is kind of a way back, because people are looking for vacations where you unplug and
That's
put
a
it
great
all away.
example. That's a great example. Find a little bit more of our well-being in interpersonal and, you know, non-interrupted. Yeah.
Yeah, just become one with yourself without
or with my friends,
Yeah.
where we're actually talking to each other. Not everybody's sitting, you know, in restaurants, everyone's sitting like this. It's like, hello, hello. It's when you see two people sitting on a sofa and they're texting each other.
It's true, it's very common. Yes. I'm going to see if there's anybody in the audience who has some questions.
Yeah, actually, Michelle, we have a question from our Facebook audience.
Okay.
Khalid Musa was asking, Elisabeth, how you balance developing for human-computer interaction as opposed to human-human interaction, and how much does human-human interaction factor into the way that you develop these human-computer interactions?
That's such a great question, because that's just where we were, wasn't it? That's perfect. When it comes to sort of any interaction that really is about a social interaction, it's always humans first. So things like notifications and interruptions and so forth. So for example, when I use the example of designers and developers, then when I'm thinking about human-computer interaction, I'm really thinking about human computation interaction. And so really thinking about what is the psychology of programming or coding. How do you have, for example, a structured coding environment where the visuals of the environment, I don't know, I'm old enough to remember when structured editors first came in. Before the structured editor, it was just really hard. I used to program in Lisp, which is a lot of brackets. It's really hard to see where all the brackets were. So, you'd scale that up to now, it's like IDEs, development environments. How do we create development environments to really work with people's problem-solving activities? So the psychology of information problem-solving and coding. So in that instance, I'm really thinking about the human and the computer and the code and the interaction there. But even in that instance, when the developer can't figure out how to do something, now what we do is we go online to social, hubs, right? So you might be in GitHub, or you might be in some online social, environment, and you go and you start to look for other programmers, other coders, other hackers, whatever it might be, who've done something. And you might copy and paste their code, or you might ask somebody how to do something. And so then I've gone from thinking about the human-computer interaction, the psychology of information and problem solving as a single person, a single brain, if you like, into thinking about how do I really think about the communication between these two people? Or this person and a community? And if you look at something like GitHub, it's really interesting because it's almost like there's a language of communication within certain developer communities around certain languages. And so if I was designing a community, the human-computer interaction there is about the human-human interaction and the language they speak together and what they're trying to do together. So the human is always central to the design, but sometimes it's the human cognition in relationship to, a formal system or a physical system, and sometimes it's in a social system.
Interesting. We have another good question, actually, from Syed. He's asking essentially about the future of AI and its ubiquitousness in technology. Will there become spaces of development that do not involve AI, or will it continue, in your view, to be a ubiquitous thing that's applied to each of the new technologies that are developed?
I think some form of computation will be in all of the digital tools because they're necessarily computational, right? But somebody once said to me about AI, and I think this is true, anything that's under this sort of name of AI, which has this mystery and this aura, remains artificial intelligence until it just becomes everyday computation. And when it is everyday computation and understood, then it just becomes an algorithm that is more or less interrogable, transparent, with data sources that are more or less interrogable and transparent. And so once we start to understand something, it no longer falls under the rubric of AI somehow. Now I did AI back in the mumbles, the 80s, right, when, very different algorithms, but the inspiration was the same. But the data sets were really small, right? And so the kinds of things we did were slightly different, but the big viewpoint was the same, which is how do you sort of learn, how do you change a system as it goes ahead? And so I think there's always going to be the mystique of AI, the excitement and the fear of AI. But the minute something becomes understood, it just becomes another set of algorithms that have utility.
Any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have one I'd like to ask. Getting to the issue of human-human interaction and human-computer interaction and sort of the perceptions of technology by people and their feelings about how other people might perceive them using technology, what can you tell us about the lessons that were learned from Google Glass and how that
Google Glass?
Yes.
Well, I did not work on Google Glass, so everything I say here has nothing to do with my company's opinions or, anything. But let me give you my layperson's, my expert but not on Google Glass opinion. Google Glass is a really, really interesting technology. And I'm going to step back just for 1 second. There are two different ways I think about research, right? So real research for me is sort of understanding a big problem space, right? And then there's some research which is understanding the solution space. Now, if you've got a solution, you should already have understood the problem. Google Glass is a technical problem space that ended up with a technical capability that was rendered into a solution space, which was a consumer solution space for which no problem space analysis had ever been done. Does that make sense? So we had a technology that was an excellent technology, from the computation to the material. I looked at some of the work which was about the ergonomics of the head that was done on getting this thing exactly right. It's a beautiful product science, material science work, the ergonomics of this device. The computation was a really, the visuals of it was just absolutely stunning, the work that was done under the hood to create Google Glass. But then the social space, the problem space of the social or the individual need was never fully looked at. So what you actually had was this rather awkward, rather unappealing thing on people's heads, which only a few people had. So what you really did was you created a disruption in the social space. Mm-hmm. And you created an inequity in the social space. And you created a fear of the other in the social space. And you rendered information of one kind that was not necessarily useful into a social situation where that information actually disrupted the interaction. So what you have is a beautiful piece of research for an amazing product that was put into a solution space, which was not the right solution space. So if you take something like Google Glass and what that made possible, and all of the great research that went into it, and you now put it, for example, into a manufacturing plant, where there are uniforms, and there are roles, and there are social structures of how information needs to be in place in the moment for a particular kind of problem solving. And you render into this information that is task relevant. Now what you have is a product that potentially amplifies the human expert in task role, that has a very particular role itself, that is not socially disruptive in its appearance, and that has a mandated reason for being on a human body. And now you have a product. You have a product that potentially amplifies the human, and I always believe human-computer interaction is always about not replacing humans, but augmenting and amplifying humans. And a lot of the big thinkers of the history of human-computer interaction, like Doug Engelbart, who was the brain behind the mouse and the first GUI and so forth in the late 60s, early 70s, he always talked about amplification, not replacement. And not necessarily even augmentation, but really you augment only in order to amplify something that has a value to the human and to the social structure. So Google Glass is a great product, but not as a consumer product, in my opinion.
One more question.
Okay.
Thanks. You talked about the user experience and human-computer interaction, where the the interaction is initiated by the human, like interrogating a device, for example. But there's also where it's initiated by the machine. Michelle mentioned getting in the elevator and hearing a song that you like. Well, maybe I'm in a bad mood and I don't want to hear that song right now. Or if I go into my home and my home starts making all these suggestions that I don't care for. How do the questions change when the interaction is initiated by the machine, by the computer?
Very good question. Again, it depends. It depends on that situation. So if I would say there's two buttons that are critical on any device. One is off and the other is undo. Possibly undo first and off. Right? Now, where that's not the right thing is in a safety critical situation. So for example, if we're in this smart building and something goes wrong and we just need to get you out, it needs to just be telling you out, 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 and I don't care that you're in a bad mood. And so safety critical systems it's really important to do a safety critical analysis of any system that you have and anything that will override a human decision and overriding who that person is. So in a smart building, evacuating us, if you're not one of the sort of safety forces, you shouldn't be overridden and we should just get you out. If you are in role as a member of the safety forces around, then you get to override, but nobody else does. And so again, I think understanding role analysis and criticality analysis needs to be put in there. And it can be social, so like a more banal example in the home, I have one of those speaking devices in the home, and when people come around, I might be in a bad mood, but it's down to the social protocol for us to negotiate that if you walk in and say, hey, so-and-so, play 70s disco, I get to tell you I don't want disco because I'm in a bad mood. So I think we leave the rest as sort of social protocol when it comes to a social situation.
Any more questions?
That seems to be it. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, one more.
You mentioned that AI sort of amplifies humans and doesn't replace them. And I was just thinking, do you know anything about AI going into the army and sort of more trying to protect humans? Because in wars and stuff, we lose a lot of people. And are we close to figuring out a way to put artificial intelligence in armies and in places where humans are being replaced, but kind of in a good way to protect them?
Yeah, I didn't say. Well, I should be clear. I believe that AI should amplify the human, so it should always start from the human as first, and not replace. But I think your point is a really, really, really good one. And I don't know anything about the army at all. But if amplification of human well-being is to not put a human in a situation, I would vote for that. Yes, absolutely. And I know that the military is investing enormously, a lot of funding actually. Most of the funding for things like user experience, I mentioned, a lot of the really big leaps forward in ergonomics and design came through and after the Second World War. And the military funded and continues to fund user experience and human-computer interaction extensively in pretty much all countries. And I think, that's important because it comes to that safety critical issue, because that really is where the rubber hits the road around safety and around caretaking and making sure more people stay safe. So I know the military always invests a great deal. The other thing that the military does, of course, is it trains humans as well. So whenever you have, excuse me, a very, very complex system, you train people to use the complex system. So training, designing systems to replace people, designing systems to really fit with people, to do overrides for human decision making when other information has come in order to keep humans safe. I know the military works on that extensively. I don't have much experience myself, but I think it's a great, great question and a good direction to go in.
Yeah, that's it from here.
That's it for the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Elisabeth will be back today at 5:30 if you want to hear more about this topic. She will have a keynote. We will also be streaming that on our system. And thank you for joining us today, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so
It's
much,
very
and thanks for the
enlightening.
great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.